The gun debate is one of America's most polarized issues. Large mass shootings always bring this debate to the forefront, eliciting strong emotions from both sides of the aisle. Many believe the answer is stricter gun laws, while others see this as government overreach and believe average citizens can better protect themselves by keeping and bearing arms. I argue that neither of these choices are likely to be effective and put forward a third option that better aligns to how information and decision-making work in systems that survive. I'm Sean McClure. You're listening to NonTrivial. So the gun debate in America is obviously a very hot topic. The gun problem, the gun issue, whatever you want to call it. You know, America has had access to all kinds of firearms, and when I say access, really the everyday citizen, right? And the question is that the right thing to do? Does it make sense to have a lot of people or your everyday kind of average Joe have access to these lethal weapons? And does that cause crime? Does that make crime get worse? Or does it prevent crime? Does it allow people to maybe protect themselves? You know, this debate has been going on really since the founding of the country. The gun is a tool where all you got to do is retract your index finger and then you can actually end someone's life, right? So it's a very powerful tool. And the decision as to where, the control of those weapons should lie, should it be, more with the government in kind of a centralized control fashion? Should it be with the everyday citizen? Maybe it's something in between. The book I'm going to use to anchor today's conversation is Armed in America by Patrick J. Charles. Armed in America, a history of gun rights from the colonial militias to concealed carry. It's a really good book. He's really done his research. He's got this big chunk of notes and references in the back. You can see he's really applied the historical methodology, correctly, arguably to the interpretation of the Second Amendment and to the history of gun laws, and really trying to understand, what did the forefathers mean when they were talking about gun rights and the right to keep and carry arms. And we're going to talk about how important it is to interpret the, Second Amendment correctly, how it has been done through history, how that kind of changed, how that's led to a lot of the polarization that we now see on the issue, like we see in so many issues. We live in a very polarized world now, right? Kind of left versus right. We'll see how it kind of led to that. I will peel back and expose what I think are the core mechanisms at play here, as I always do in NonTrivial. And then, as I always do, I will use those mechanisms to make my argument as to what I think is a good solution, as opposed to the usual two solutions, which is either kind of give everybody guns or impose some harsh regulations or something kind of in between. But I don't think those are particularly effective solutions for reasons that I will talk about. I don't think they respect the way that, systems work and decision-making works and aggregations and information and all that kind of good stuff. So I'll use my kind of mechanistic understanding of situations like this to put forward what I think is a better solution. So let us begin by, and again, that book is Armed in America by Patrick J. Charles. Go ahead and check that out. It's a really a well-researched piece of work. And I think regardless of which side of the, kind of divide you are on, or whether or not you sit in the middle, whatever, go ahead and check that out to get a good history of gun rights in America. So this really comes down to the Second Amendment, right? When people are talking about the right to keep and carry arms, they're really, kind of alluding or going back to the Second Amendment, this piece of the Constitution that is supposed to be, a piece of writing that we can rely on to know what, the original founders of the country were thinking and what they were saying. And if this is, still the law, still the rule, then we should just follow what the Second Amendment says, and then we know what to do. Right? Second Amendment says things like, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So you've got some interesting language in there. You got a well-regulated militia. Okay, let's talk about what that is for a second. And also the right of the people to keep and bear arms. So keep arms means to keep it in your home, essentially, so you can protect your family. Bear arms means you can carry it from place to place. Okay, so to keep and bear arms, keep it in your home, carry it around. Well, the language in the Second Amendment is not something that is super obvious. And the reason is because this is the change. The language goes through changes throughout the decades and throughout the centuries, right? This is what happens linguistically. Words don't mean the same thing as They used to. They sometimes they do, but a lot of times they don't. There's different kind of setting. There's different context. We live in a different world than we lived in back then. So when you read things like the people, and well regulated and infringed, you got to really think about what these words mean. Remember in my democracy episode, I was actually talking about, the founders were kind of laying down, the Constitution and talking about the rights of the people, and that they essentially going to be free. And then, we said, well, we don't really know what they meant by the people. Like, is that every single person that lives in the country as long as you are a citizen? Or is it kind of the elites? Is it kind of the people that are more like the founders, right? And we kind of argued for the latter, based on John Keene's book, The Life and Death of Democracy. So this is what happens with language. And the reason why this is important to understand is because we cannot just call upon a historical document and say, now we know the facts. It's just not that simple. You can't just say, well, this is what the Second Amendment says, which is true. That's a fact. And therefore, and then after the therefore, this is when you get in trouble, because now what you're doing is interpretation. And it's the interpretation of the Second Amendment that is going to cause a lot of issues, because we don't really know what they meant by the people. Nobody really has the answer to this about what they meant by the people, who they meant by the people. And so, as Patrick Charles argues, he says if you really do the proper historical methodology and really take a look at what people were, what language meant at the time and how people were interpreting that Second Amendment, they didn't mean the people as kind of the everyday citizen or the average Joe to keep and carry arms. They were actually talking about a well-regulated militia, which of course is also some language that appears in the Second Amendment, right? A well-regulated militia. So a well-regulated militia, what is that? Well, you can kind of think of things, and we'll do this throughout this episode, in terms of three levels. Three levels where, the decision of what to do with a powerful weapon like firearms can lay. That the decision making can happen at the individualistic granular level. That's the everyday citizen of society. You, me, your teacher, whoever. Anybody can have the right to keep and carry arms. They can make life and death decisions with that tooling, with those tools. That's the individualistic granular level, the individual. Okay, you can interpret the people to mean that, which kind of makes sense. I mean, the way we use the people today seems to be kind of more individualistic, right? The other is at the very top level, which would be something like the government, right? The government or a standing army, right? You got to imagine there was actually debate originally in the founding of the United States of America whether or not they even needed a standing army, which kind of sounds funny now, but you got to remember, and we talked about this in the democracy episode as well, that the United States of America is geographically isolated. And they didn't really have intentions of going to war or really getting into many armed conflicts, other than maybe just some kind of internal stuff, right? They've got the battleships over in Britain protecting them, and the only foreign policy by George Washington was basically, let's not go to war, right? To paraphrase it. So they're geographically isolated. They had no intentions. Of course, the world wars and other conflicts changed all that. So okay, you got the individualistic, granular, everyday person that could maybe make life and death decisions with that tool, what they should do, what can they own? The ownership of the firearms can apply to that level, or firearms should be more top level, government controlled. The standing army has control, and then you've got something in between, which you would call a well-regulated militia. A militia is a organization or a group that is formed by everyday citizens, but those citizens are trained specifically to use firearms. Okay, so knowledge plays a really, really big role. Training plays a really big role. It's not just the everyday Joe grabbing a firearm and then maybe having, a little test that they pass and then they have access to the firearm. It is a group that is dedicated to constant training and education in how to use the firearms and how to use them in specific situations, if citizens are being threatened or whatever. So that is the militia. Well, Patrick Charles argues that if you really look at the Second Amendment and you understand the language of the time, what they were referring to when they say the people have the right to keep and bear arms is they meant the people of the militia. The militia has the right to be armed, okay? And that is the people because it's formed of citizens. But it wasn't the people as an everyday average Joe can go get access to a firearm just so that they can protect themselves. Okay, so that was the interpretation for the majority of U.S. history. According to Patrick Charles, and if you really look at how people were talking in the day. So that's the quote unquote correct interpretation of the Second Amendment, okay, according to Patrick Charles. Now, you can imagine that people start to fight against this a little bit, and really where this changes is the passing of the Sullivan Act. The Sullivan Act in New York State, 1911, and it basically started to put rules and regulations in place that forced you to get a permit in order to purchase and carry firearms. And so now we're starting to see some of these, and there are different reasons why the Sullivan Act was enacted. You've got, certain kind of high profile cases, maybe where people are getting killed. And there's this kind of public outcry, as there is, right? Whenever, like I said in the introduction, whenever a big event happens, there's a public outcry. And that public outcry causes people to say, hey, let's do something, just do something. You hear that all the time, right? Quote unquote, just do something. The government needs to do something. What are they going to do? And so they being a government, they have to react. I mean, it's kind of the same as COVID, right? Something happens, it's scary, it's in the news, just do something. You're supposed to do something. And so the government has to kind of have these reactions, for better or worse. So the Sullivan Act was passed. And then you have organizations like the NRA. As NRA starts to get, the National Rifle Association starts to form, you've got a few other organizations in there, but you start to get these kind of gun rights people or activists getting together. And they were predominantly just about, gun safety and marksmanship and hunting. It was never really about trying to squash regulation or trying to go against legislature that was trying to instill more gun laws. In fact, they were even a little bit in favor of that too, because it was all about just, organizations like the NRA was just, we want to have the right to own our guns, but we just want it for hunting. We want it to be able to go outdoors. And we do think people should be using these safely. And in fact, we want to be a part of teaching people how to use these safely. But as more and more legislation started to get passed, that brought more and more rules around how you could purchase firearms, use the carry arms, how you could keep and carry or not those firearms, then these groups like the NRA start to become more in opposition to those pieces of legislation. Okay. And again, you've got some high profile cases that are happening, but really, overseas, people were starting to view the United States as kind of the country of homicides, quote unquote. There's just a lot of violence in the United States throughout the 1800s and 1900s, right? 19th, 20th century. And the government, the forces that be, had to figure out a way to deal with that, right? And obviously a lot of those crimes were being committed with weapons, right? Pistols, firearms. And so the regulations were starting to get passed. So you got the Sullivan Act that comes into play. Then you've got groups like the NRA starting to form and come together and really kind of get themselves organized. And as opposed to just promoting the everyday safe use of firearms, it became more about squashing bills. And what the NRA became very, very good at. So if you ever want to look at an organization that kind of mobilizes itself against for or against bills that are being passed, look at the NRA, whether you love them or hate them. I mean, they were very, very good at this. They mobilized their members. They would become aware of the bills that were being part of the discussion immediately. They would, basically create these pamphlets or newsletters that would go out to all their members, and their members would be mobilized to start, writing or talking to, whatever congressmen or people of the Congress, whatever they had to do to basically start to squash that bill. And you have, and that this is in stark contrast to, the general public, who is becoming more and more aware, obviously, of the violence in the country. And the overwhelming majority of people wanted more gun regulations, but groups like the NRA started to push against that. And so, even though you've got the public really wanting a lot of gun regulation, you still get a lot of the bills getting squashed because organizations like the NRA are just so effective at doing it. So they mobilize their forces. And there's, just really kind of interesting history that Patrick Charles, in his book Armed in America, goes through about the NRA, how they get together, they become more organized. They become quite intelligent, actually, in the way that they squash the bills, and they become very, very effective about what they're doing. They got their own, quote unquote propaganda. They do a lot of this political straddling. Again, it's not politicized yet. It's not very polarized as it is today. It wasn't more of a left or of a right issue. Sometimes, it would be people in Congress that were on the left that they would agree with, and sometimes it would be people on the right. Eventually, you have big assassinations like Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, right? 1968. Of course, before that, you had John F. Kennedy. So you've got some big assassinations in there that are bringing, gun regulations to the attention of the everyday public. And, you've got JFK, who was assassinated by, this Italian kind of carbide weapon. And he was actually, JFK was trying to pass a bill at the time, or just previous to that, to not allow that specific type of Italian weapon to enter the country. And so there's this kind of question in the public, well, maybe he wouldn't have been assassinated if that bill had been passed. And then you've got this NRA group who's squashing those bills and not, saying, look, that's going to restrict our rights. We're patriotic. We have rights to these weapons. So they keep squashing. So basically what's happening is the public is starting to view the NRA as a quote unquote gun lobby, because that's really what they're doing, right? They're just constantly lobbying against these bills. They start to take kind of a sour note. They don't look very good. And this is kind of 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, right? Those assassinations are happening in the 60s. And then you start moving into, and just going to wrap up a bit of history here, the 70s and the 80s, and that's kind of getting into the golden age of the NRA. And what's happening here, remember I mentioned that the overwhelming amount of research, if not all of it, dedicated to the interpretation of the Second Amendment said that that was really about a well-regulated militia. It was not about the everyday citizen, right? It was the well-regulated militia that is meant to have those firearms. Well, the NRA is actually able to switch the research on this. There's this kind of panacea of researchers that they help fund, and they say, like, we're going to revisit this because we don't think that's the right way to interpret the Second Amendment, which is fair. I mean, you're allowed to do that. You can go do your own research. But they start funding that research, and they start to kind of reinterpret the Second Amendment, and all of a sudden they flip the amount of research 2-to-1, meaning there's twice as much research now that suggests, historical research that suggests the Second Amendment should be interpreted as the right to keep and carry arms for the individual, not a well-regulated militia, but that most granular individualistic level of society. And so that they flip that 2-to-1. So you can see the power of groups like the NRA, these essentially what are lobby groups, which they eventually kind of embraced. The 70s and 80s, NRA basically said, you know what, yeah, we are lobbying. That's what we do because we think that's what's right. And the public kind of kept giving them that moniker. They weren't registered as a true lobby for tax reasons, but they eventually kind of filled that role. But you can see the power of mobilizing people within a group for political reasons, of funding certain research. And then we get to this point where now you've got the public who's largely in favor of, as they have been kind of throughout history, of gun regulations. But then you've got this other big chunk of people, actually. The public starts to become very divided, who are in favor of, the patriotic right to own, to keep and carry firearms, right? And that's because now they can, the people are getting influenced by the research that's available, right? By the propaganda that's being used. And so now it's becoming very, very divided. So lobbying is very effective. The mobilization of those people to switch and squash bills are very, very effective. It starts to become, the NRA and the gun rights start to become more associated with those on the right, Republicans, for a variety of historic reasons. So then it became a left versus right issue. You've got research to call upon, and on and on. And so now we're at the stage where it's a very divided issue. A lot of people think, yes, everybody has the right keep and carry arms. It means the individual. That's the correct way to interpret the Second Amendment. And I can call upon research to show you that that is the case. And then you got the other side of things that think, no, this is something we do. Okay, so we don't really talk about militias anymore. And I'll get back to this in a second. It's something that the government should impose, that top level that we talked about. That's where the decision making for something as powerful as firearms should be held. And the government can decide, what kind of guns we have access to, and on and on. And so now we've got this kind of left versus right issue of gun rights in America. And there's a lot more to it. So go check out Armed in America by Patrick Charles. It's really, really interesting kind of breakdown of different bills and different tactics that were used. And with regards to the calling upon the research, I say a lot, you should not, this is a good example of why you should not use research to rest your arguments on. Don't use research. And I know that sounds funny, almost bad, right? Like, what do you mean? Like, I want to be an informed citizen. So I want to be able to call upon, isn't the best thing I could do is to go look at, whether it's scientific research or historical research, things that academic institutions have put in place from a research perspective, and then use that to base my arguments on, right? It seems like a good thing to do. That would make me a truly informed citizen. But unfortunately, there's all kinds of problems in there. There's all kinds of, funding for the studies. There's lobby groups. There's deep bias in that. And what you'll find with studies is they flip-flop back and forth. I've talked about this before. You could argue, a vegan versus a carnivore maybe is getting into a debate, and the carnivore might be saying, well, actually vegans kill more animals than carnivores. And the vegan might be saying, no, that's not true. I found a paper. We don't kill as many animals as you do, and it goes back and forth and goes back and forth. Or you can talk about, saturated fats or nutritional, and everybody's going to be able to find studies to support what they want because it's going to flip and flop. The reason why it flips and flops is because of something I like to call proxy distance. So anytime you are observing something or making a measurement, there's always whatever it is you're looking at is a proxy to the true underlying reality. Okay, that's always the case. Now, in simple systems, that proxy distance is very small. Some of the more simpler physics that you would do, where it's basically, bodies acting in vacuums and forces and vectors, it's quite close, presumably, to the underlying reality, even though there is still a proxy there. You don't have direct access to the underlying reality, but whatever it is you're measuring is pretty close to the reality, right? But you start getting into chemistry, and then biology, and then higher complexity, all the way to sociology and economics. Whatever it is you're looking at, observing, more and more interpretation has to be layered onto that, because whatever it is you're measuring or observing is a proxy that could be quite far from the true underlying reality that we don't have access to. Of course, we don't have access to it for those causal opacity reasons that I've talked about in the past, right? Complex systems don't condescend to give you the information that's directly attached to reality. So anyway, proxy distance just means whatever you're looking at, it's really just a proxy for something else, and it might be not that close to the something else that you think you're measuring. Okay, so this is the issue when you get into complex. Is red wine good for you? Is dark chocolate good for you? Is vegan diet good? Is carnivore diet good? How should we interpret the Second Amendment, right? You start to get very, very complex issues, and you can go do all the research you want. There's nothing in the statistical arsenal that's going to help you totally isolate on one side. And we know that because you see that. It flips and flops and flips. Take any issue. You'll see it's flipping and flopping on both sides for any reasonably non-trivial complex issue. So you shouldn't use studies to anchor your argument. Now, I'm going to have an answer to this that I'll wrap up later, because obviously that kind of begs the question, what the heck am I supposed to use? If shouldn't I be an informed citizen, and shouldn't I look at scientific and historical research to base that? And I'm not saying it's completely useless, but I'll tell you a much better approach. But okay, so we talked about the Second Amendment. We talked about the interpretation, the fact that we can't use the Second Amendment as just this historical document, this factual statement that tells us what we're supposed to do, and tells us what the founders meant, right? Language changes, goes through linguistics, goes through different contexts, and we can't just take those words to mean what they do today. So we got to do a lot of interpretation on top of that. The proxy distance is very, very large and stuff like that. We talked about the NRA and how they became a lobby group and how they really started to just be very, very effective at squashing bills. And you've got all these kind of, you've got different assassinations and violence happening, and yada, yada, yada. Goes to the big polarized setting that we have now. What should we do about the gun problem in America? Well, what I want to do now is peel back the mechanisms like I do in NonTrivial. This is the point, right? I step back from these situations and I look at them agnostically, and I say, look, I don't care if it's about the gun rights. I don't care if it's about abortion. Maybe we're talking about religion. Maybe we're talking about science, technology. At some level, it doesn't actually matter. Let's step back and understand the fundamental core properties of these types of situations, and then use those to start to base our arguments and base our thoughts around. And that's a much more effective, wise thing to do. So let's start with the fact that decision-making is typically best done at the aggregate level. Okay, so I'll use ant colonies again. I do this a lot just because you can think of them as individual agents or pieces that come together into a system, and they interact together to solve a very hard problem. Okay, so you've got simple problems, right, which are kind of things that are not overly complex. They're deterministic. You can easily kind of design a solution to. And then you've got hard problems that have no obvious solution to them. They're opaque. You typically have to embrace a lot of trial and error in order to solve them. Well, ants, and all kinds of examples in nature, if not all of nature, regularly solves hard problems, right? One of those hard problems is trying to, locate resources, food. And they want to do this by, essentially finding the shortest path between 2 points. And I talked about this in the past. Okay, so a lot of ants get together. And at the local level, meaning the individual ants, they're actually pretty quote unquote dumb, right? They just have these local interaction rules where, they kind of, don't just bump into an ant, kind of go around it, follow an ant by its smell, right? They release these pheromones. So if I keep following these ants by their smell, I'll be able to I'll just follow them, and that's it. And there's nothing out there. There's no reason behind it other than just follow the pheromones. But at the aggregate level, when you have thousands and thousands of ants going through these little local interaction rules, what ends up happening is they solve a really hard problem, which is to find the shortest path between 2 points in a complex environment. That's because the shortest path is going to have those pheromones linger in the air longer because you have more ants statistically traveling the shortest path than you do the longer path. So anyway, without getting into too much details, if you can kind of envision that, or you can go look it up. But basically what happens is you got all these ants that are going around, they're releasing pheromones, and what will emerge out of that is the decision, if you will, of which path to take, which ends up being the best or one of the best you could possibly take in a complex environment. That's actually a very hard problem to solve. If you try to just step back and you try to look at your environment and you try to reason about which way you would take, you wouldn't solve that problem effectively. But if you just release thousands of ants and you allow them to have these little simple rules with respect to following pheromones, they will solve that problem. Okay, so decision making for really, really hard problems, which is what we see in society. I talk about increasing the complexity, going from chemistry to biology, getting into economics and sociology and all these things, all the way to history. These are really, really complex things, interpretations, tons of factors, tons of variables coming in, lots of interacting pieces. Those solutions of what to do in these situations to solve these hard problems have to come about by methods similar to the ant problem. You have to have the decision-making happen at the aggregate. The decisions have to emerge. Okay? So that's a point I want to make. That's just, it doesn't matter. We're talking about abortion, gun law, whatever it is, right? Whatever the issue is, you step back. We know that that's how hard problems get solved, right? Well, this means, let's bring it back to gun laws now. And you might say, okay, so the first point I'm going to make then is that, these kind of life and death important decisions, if you will, about guns, how to own them, how much should be given, how many rights are this and that shouldn't really be done at the individualistic level, because that's not the level that we see good decision-making take place for really hard problems. And this is a hard problem. There's a lot of different factors at play here. The guns can be misused. Are we talking about just keeping or just carrying? Is it concealed carry? Is it not? What type of weapon? What about the automatic weapons, the semi-automatic weapons? What about the assault rifles? Age limits, 48-hour cooldown periods. Should people be able to mail in their weapon? Can we get it from a different country? Can you saw off the end of it? Whatever, on and on and on. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of factors that go into what is a very, very powerful tool that can very easily end someone else's life. Should that kind of decision-making be made at that granular individualistic level? That's kind of like saying we've got this really hard problem about finding the shortest path in a complex environment. Should we just let the individual ants make that decision? I mean, on the face, that sounds pretty stupid because we know ants are pretty dumb. We don't think about humans as being dumb, but quote unquote, they kind of are. And I don't mean that in a kind of a derogatory sense. I just mean we should think of us as individual agents where our intelligence as humanity comes about not because we are individuals who are smart. Remember, I talked about in that episode on there are no giants, right? There are only shoulders. Everything that we do as society is because of our social ability to interact. All the inventions that, it doesn't matter if it's a theory of relativity, doesn't matter if it's Edison's, light bulb, doesn't matter what it is. The inventions, the innovations, the technological progress, it's because we work together so effectively, the social interaction that allows these things to emerge. It's not individuals who are doing it. So to say that the individual should have the ability to kind of make decisions around this powerful tool and what is really a hard problem with respect to how to best use that tool. I mean, think about the situation you would be in, right? You're the teacher of a school and somebody breaks in. Now you're the one who is responsible for, figuring out when to pull out the gun, when to shoot, how to protect the children, how not to hit the children, how not do all this kind of stuff. Should that really be done at the individualistic level? At the granular level, I would argue no. But now you might be thinking, okay, so you're obviously siding on the other side of the debate. So you think the government should just, put a bunch of restrictive gun laws in place and that should be that. Well, there's a problem with that side too. Okay, so again, just to really recap really quickly, I said decision-making for really hard problems should happen at the aggregate level. It should emerge from many, many people interacting together. So individuals shouldn't really be making their own decision with respect to gun rights, to the gun laws, in my opinion, how to use those guns, yada, yada. Now, the other side of that is you could say, okay, so I guess the government should have, should be the decision-making body. Well, at first blush, that seems kind of true because the government is supposed to be the aggregate decision maker, right? We vote people into power, we elect those individuals, and those are the people who are supposed to take, the popular. Remember, we talked about the indices of representativeness in the democracy episode, right? They're supposed to represent the popularity. They're supposed to have representation on universality, on goodness, right? They're supposed to capture the aggregate, most popular kind of emergent, if you will, decision that's made by the group of people. So the aggregate decision maker, which is where we want decisions to be made for hard problems, should be reflected in the government. But think about the world that we're living in now. We're living in a very kind of post-truth world, right? We've got a lot of misinformation, disinformation, false news, propaganda, both government and citizens with different agendas. We've got social media. We've got all kinds of noise in the channel. And when you add a lot of noise into the channel, the otherwise really good aggregate decision maker like the government starts to suffer because democracy doesn't really work under those situations. Think about it. Even if you have really, really good representativeness, right? People are looking at the world. They're on social media. They're making their decisions. They think of themselves as informed decisions, and then they elect those leaders into power. And those powers that be are reflecting those wishes of the public. That's all true under representative democracy, and I still think it is largely true today. But if the opinions of the people are flawed or thwarted, or they're having all kinds of bad misinterpretations because of the noise in the channel, then even with perfect representativeness, the government isn't really doing what it's supposed to do. It's not able to be a good aggregate decision maker. Okay, I'll use some examples. We got the Roe v. Wade, the whole abortion issue going on. You could say, well, I ran, a Gallup poll. I ran a poll, and I found that the overwhelming majority of people are in favor of the original kind of Roe v. Wade, and it shouldn't be overturned, or whatever side you want to take. But then you realize, yeah, but people don't actually really understand that case, do they? Do they really understand Roe v. Wade? Do they understand what it stands for? And if you actually talk to people, you realize that most people don't. What they really have is kind of the sensationalist, kind of social media version that was projected to them, and that probably already resonated with their kind of underlying worldview, and that's their take on it, right? And that could be for both sides of the equation, whether you're for or against it. Florida's "Don't Say Gay" bill, right? Well, it doesn't even talk about gay, right? It doesn't really talk about that word. It doesn't say that in there, and yet people call it the "quote unquote" "Don't Say Gay" bill. So the overwhelming majority of people think that's what it's about, and now they're starting to vote based on an opinion that is kind of nonsensical, right? Like it's not even based on reality. So this is the problem: is that the general public will form opinions in a very, very noisy channel, and those opinions are used to elect people into power under the mechanism of representative democracy. But the representativeness in representative democracy, to get this to work as an aggregate decision maker, is a necessary but insufficient condition, because the other condition needed here is to have the general public know what the hell they're talking about. And the general public today, in today's climate, find it very, very hard to know what the hell they're talking about. And it's not to their own fault. It's because of social media. It's because of misinformation, disinformation, post-truth, propaganda, agenda. It's everywhere. And the internet has exacerbated this problem. And so we are living in such a noisy channel, if you will, that we're not getting a good signal from the environment, okay? And it's really hard. So the representative democracy is not enough of a mechanism to guarantee that the aggregate decision-making, going back to gun laws, should be done by the government, because they're representing the public. So whatever the public is thinking, they don't really know what they're talking about anyways. They don't know how to discern or discriminate among the information that they should to become an informed citizen. It's almost like, I would argue that you cannot be an informed citizen anymore. Right. And then we go back to the problems with the research. Research is getting funded by different groups. It's not like, oh, this is statistically this and therefore it's true, because, take the Second Amendment interpretation. You've got research on both sides. Take dark chocolate, red wine, carnivore diet, vegan diet. You've always got research on both sides of the equation. It's always going to keep changing. It's always going to keep flipping and flopping. Remember, I talked about that proxy distance being very large. You cannot be an informed citizen today. That is a meaningless statement, I would argue. Okay, the channel's too noisy. So I'm arguing that you need aggregate decision making. I'm arguing that it doesn't make sense for gun decisions, if you will, to be made at the granular level. So I don't think the individual interpretation of the Second Amendment is a good one. I don't think individuals should really be getting access to any guns and being able to defend themselves in situations. Would I be able to defend myself in that situation? I don't know. Grab a gun, start acting like James Bond. I mean, come on. These are really hard, complex situations. I don't think everybody's trained for that. But the government, which otherwise would be a good aggregate decision maker, that mechanism is deeply, deeply flawed now because of the noise in the channel. So I don't think they're the answer either. Okay. You can kind of think of it as, imagine taking an eyedropper to the ant colony, and that eyedropper contains pheromone, and I'm dripping pheromone where it's not supposed to be. And now the ants start going off course, right? And they start doing wrong things. Remember, I also talked about a few episodes back about the ant mill, or the death spiral, right? The cost of complexity, right? So ants will pick up on pheromones from an ant that slightly deviated from the right path, and then other ants follow, and other ants follow, and all of a sudden you got hundreds of ants going around in a circle, and they eventually exhaust and die, right? That's called a death spiral, or an ant mill. Go look that up. And you can say, well, that's so dumb. I mean, why would ants be created like that? Why would they have evolved like that? To kind of just spin off into death. But that's the cost of complexity. That local level dumbness is really, really needed to get really, really good aggregate level decision making, which is what ants do at the top level. Okay, stand too close, things look crazy, but you step back, you get the bigger picture, you see why things are. Okay, so let's just kind of wrap this up and move into what I think is a better solution. So again, just really quickly, we talked about the Second Amendment is really what anchors this debate, this conversation, but it really, really comes down to the interpretation, and that interpretation is going to flip and flop on both sides. We've got lobby groups like the NRA that are able to work against these bills, even if the public overwhelmingly wants something. And we've got their ability to kind of do a flip on what the research says. So, and then you add into that the fact that from a mechanistic standpoint, we want aggregate level decision making. From a systems perspective, we know that that's really good. And so you might think that means the government should be making decisions about firearms, but we've got these noisy channels. And so the mechanism of representative democracy really breaks down, because even with perfect representativeness, you're representing really kind of dumb, misleading, or just bad opinions of the public, because the general public is not able to be informed citizens. So it doesn't matter if you got the representation there. The noisy channel precludes the ability to do that. Okay. And so now we got to think about what a solution might be. So, okay, if what I'm saying now is we can't have the individuals making the decisions, but the government is also not the answer, then what is the answer? Well, I think we need to revisit this idea of a well-regulated militia. Now, you could say, well, we have militias today, right? I mean, we've got those private militias that happen where people kind of get together and they're citizens and they're gun lovers, and they probably have some opinions, against government tyranny and things like this. And okay, but that's not a true well-regulated militia. It's not standardized. It's not regulated. It's not really what we're talking about, right? And then you could say, well, we've got the National Guard, right? The National Guard, but it kind of fits the technical definition of today's militia, but that's not what the founders meant when they said a well-regulated militia, because that's not composed of citizens, right? The National Guard is the army, and that's a tie to the government, a tie to the army. A soldier is not an everyday citizen. What I'm talking about is more what the founders had in mind. And you got to imagine that founders had these in mind for a reason. They were coming from countries that had a lot of monarchy, a lot of centralization of power, a lot of things that were not going good in their country. And so for them to think up a well-regulated militia as a solution to something as powerful as firearms was probably there for a reason. Now, Patrick Charles does talk about the logistics of the militia ended up kind of being hard, and it started to kind of degrade over time. But again, that might have been deviating from the true dream of what a true well-regulated militia is. Okay, so remember I talked about you've got the three levels to think about where the decision-making for firearms need to take place. It's either at the individualistic, everyday citizen level, which is one interpretation of the Second Amendment, or it's at the government top level, which would be kind of the aggregate decision maker. But again, we've got problems. So I've argued we've got problems with both of those. In the middle, that kind of third option is a well-regulated militia, which does not exist today. The private militias, that's not a true well-regulated militia. It's not regulated. It's not standardized. It's got no standards about how to do the training and what to do in situations. And then you've got the National Guard, which would be the government, and that's not good either. That's kind of directly tied to a standing army. That's not the everyday citizen. A true well-regulated militia, something that we don't have today, would be comprised of just citizens. So you'd get the representation of true citizens. It would be kind of extra parliamentary. Remember in the democracy episode, we said that if you want to, in a monitory democracy sense, make sure that democracy is going well, you have to have a body formed that isn't part of that democratic group, the usual government. It has to be extra parliamentary. So it can be like a watchdog on the process of democracy. This is somewhat similar to that. A true well-regulated militia would kind of be extra parliamentary or extra governmental. It wouldn't be the government. It might have an arm's length connection to the government to help with the standardization or the regularization of the training, but it would not be the government. And the reason why this is important is because if you look at the true goal, when you talk about the gun law, the gun problem, the gun debate, what it really comes down to is two things. One, everyday citizens want to know that they can protect themselves. And two, we want to have a check on power so that tyranny can't happen. Okay? And that's been right from the founding of the United States of America. That was always the case. Citizens have to be able to protect themselves. We have to have a check on tyranny. And those are not bad reasons to do things. I mean, we got all kind of historic precedent. The majority of human civilization was tyranny, right? Or some kind of centralization of power, dictatorship, monarchy. I mean, that's where these, founders were coming from, right? Immigrating out from those countries and starting something new. So it makes sense. Like, yes, we have to protect ourselves, and yes, we have to check on power. Those are the true reasons. So when we get into the gun debate and people are like, oh, we need to give a little bit maybe to a certain amount of guns to the individual, but then the government has to, have the power for more of the automatic weapons. And then 48-hour cooldown period, mail order. What about the foreign weapons? Can they come in? Can we saw off the end? What about and you start nitpicking? Remember when I talked about the rich can't penny pinch? Whenever you're into a complex situation and you're doing a lot of this penny pinching in between trying to balance both sides, you that's not where the solution is going to exist. You need a paradigm shift. You need to completely revisit the situation, step outside, and come in with a completely new paradigm. And I think that's what the true definition of a militia would be as a potential solution to this problem, because it kind of sits in the middle. It's not the private militia. It's not the average Joe. It's not it's something like a standing army. It's not the National Guard. It's not individuals owning guns. It's not the government owning guns. It's a body that is independent really of either, but it's composed of the citizens. So you've got that good representation. I think that is in line with the true goals or reasons that underlie the gun debate, which is, again, we need to protect the citizens and we need to avoid tyranny. Okay, so you can imagine something like a well-regulated militia. Let's say it's a group of citizens. Maybe you create this by sortition. Remember the democracy episode? We said that a good way to get, well, the only way to get a true democracy is not by electing representatives, right? But is to do a random sampling from the population. And you can do it in a way where that random sampling is make sure you get a certain number of minorities in there. You kind of get that breakdown that you expect to be represented. But other than that, it's a random sample. So you randomly sample the citizens that have these, and obviously the people want to be part of a militia. And that group would be well regulated. They'd have standardized training. They'd know how to use firearms. They'd know how to handle themselves in specific situations. But it's also, so you got that good citizen representation. You got the random sampling. You could put these people potentially into schools, and you might say, well, I don't want people with firearms in schools. Well, we can't pretend that people are not going to own firearms. We can't pretend that criminals are not going to get access to firearms. We know that banning doesn't work. I talked about that in my Technology is Humanity episode when I talked about the simultaneous invention mechanism, right, where something's always going to pop up somewhere. The banning doesn't really make sense. Criminals are going to get access to weapons no matter what. So let's not be overly quixotic here. Let's be realistic and understand that that's going to be the case. But if guns are going to find their ways into schools, should it really be the teacher who has a Glock under his deck that whips it out, as if he's some kind of superhero to protect the children? Or should it be a well-regulated militia who has the training, has the understanding? It's not going to be a perfect solution, but I think that makes a lot more sense for the protection of children in schools or people in public places. Okay, so that satisfies the protecting the public piece. It also satisfies the potential avoidance of tyranny because it's not the government. And so you can imagine that the militia, the well-regulated militia, is having their own votes. They're making their own decisions. They might decide, do you think that, the government is starting to overreach? But it would be a group of citizens that is randomly sampled that's making that decision. Okay. And here's the real kind of key here is if you were to do something like forming a well-regulated militia by sortition, by random sampling, we know that random sampling is robust to noise, not perfectly, but is much more robust to noise, meaning the biases that people have, the agendas people have, the misinformation, disinformation, the random sample helps protect against that. Representative democracy does not help protect against that because the election mechanism is bringing in people's informed, quote unquote, decisions into power, but those decisions are flawed. But if you randomly sample the group that's making the decision, it helps kind of cancel out a lot of those biases. Okay, so the random sampling to create the well-regulated militia could potentially help be more robust to the noise of social media, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and all that. And that would be what you would want in the aggregate decision maker. Again, we want decisions to be made in aggregate. Okay, so that's my basic solution. So we talked about the interpretation of the Second Amendment. We talked about how, the NRA and the lobbying and all this kind of led to a lot of the polarization we see today. We said that decision-making needs to be made at the aggregate level. We said that you might think that means, therefore, the answer is obvious. Individuals shouldn't be making those decisions. We should leave it to the government. But the representative democratic mechanism that underlies the government is flawed if you have a lot of noise in the channel, which is what we see today. And so, I obviously led that into the fact that a well-regulated militia might be kind of a nice third option. It's kind of a paradigm shift. It's not about how much does the government get or how many do citizens get. It's a completely extra parliamentary group of people that come together. You do it in a random sampling fashion so that it's more robust to the noise of misinformation. And I think it could satisfy ultimately the two goals that you really, really want to have when it comes to the gun debate, which is to protect the everyday citizen and also put a check on power when it comes to tyranny. Okay, so something to think about. I'm sure there's all kinds of logistical challenges to forming a well-regulated militia, but I think that's a true regulated militia is something that we should revisit as an idea today. I just want to end off by saying that really what this is the difference between being an informed citizen and a wise citizen. I don't think you can really be an informed citizen today. I think that notion is very problematic because misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, it's very, social media, you're getting pulled in different directions. All these different agendas are out there that are trying to thwart you. It's kind of like the eyedropper of pheromone. It's dropping into our ant colony and it's leading us to all these different directions. So when you form an opinion on something, whether that's Roe v. Wade, whether that's the Don't Say Gay bill, whether that's something related to gun laws, gun rights, you're probably, your quote unquote informed opinion is probably deeply flawed. And I'm including myself in that. If I'm only going to use research and I'm only going to use what I read about in social media to form my opinions, that's going to be deeply flawed. I don't think you can be an informed citizen, but you can be a wise citizen. And to be a wise citizen, that means to look at the properties of these situations, of these systems, step back from it and say, here's what we do know about how information and how systems work, how, when groups get together, how decision-making happens. We know that as general, timeless, profound truths, these take place in these types of situations. And now I can sit my opinions on top of that. So I don't have to go chase research. I don't have to go chase a bunch of opinions on social media. I can say, hey, in this case, this is the gun law, or maybe it's abortion, or maybe it's technology, maybe it's religion, whatever it is. I know I have a good understanding of the timeless truths that exist, the patterns that keep reemerging in situations like this. And I'm going to use that as my foundation to sit my opinions on top of. So don't be an informed citizen, which I argue is impossible. Be a wise citizen. Understand the patterns, understand the timeless truths, and use that to create your opinions. Okay? That's all for this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to NonTrivial on Patreon so you get to hear my bonus talk after each episode. Just head on over to patreon.com/nontrivial and click on the Become a Patron button. Please give NonTrivial 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. And if you like this episode, please send it to a friend you think might enjoy it. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, you're listening to NonTrivial, the podcast that uncovers the patterns that help you understand and navigate our complex world.